Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to CBR MTG. My name is Angus, and I'm here joined with Henry. Henry, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Very good, thank you. If you're watching this now, you're watching on twitch.tv/CBRMTG. You can find it later on YouTube. That's youtube.com/CBRMTG. If you've never checked out 7 Point Highlander before, it's a great format. Would highly recommend. You can check it out on 7ph.com.au. And finally, of course, our Discord. 7 Point Discord is open here. We do a lot of chatting on Discord, so if you're not in there already, it's a great time to get in. Um, Today we're talking about the regional championships, the one that actually you won quite recently, Henry. So congratulations, of course, on the win.
Thank you very much. I had a great time over at Petersham Town Hall.
It was excellent. And I mean, tell us. We can see you here on this next slide over in the top eight. What were you playing, and how was your event? How did you enjoy it?
I had an excellent time, but admittedly, I have almost as much of a home field advantage as you possibly could, given that I live 10 minutes away from the venue. So I got a really, really nice time. I had a lovely stroll over, had my breakfast in the morning, got a good time chatting with friends. I was playing Boros Legends, an aggro deck based around legendary creatures, specifically trying to make use of like Mox Amber, Yoshimaru, Flowering of the White Tree, that kind of stuff. Um, I only got into 7 Point Highlander back in February this year. I came down to CanCon with a bunch of friends, and they all played in the event, and that was a lot of fun. Um, but I hadn't played before, so I didn't want to have my first tournament of my first try at 7 Point be the big tournament at CanCon. So I started playing at Ashfield in Sydney in February. I took apart a Col CDH deck to build a very bad uh, sort of artifact equipment aggro deck with like Fervent Champion and GT. It
Okay,
was a great time.
that's fun. That's
Um,
fun. And why did you
and,
settle on Boros?
well, it was already a Boros deck that I had a lot of powerful cards for.
Hmm.
And I just wanted to have a cheap entry point into the format with like just taking apart my Cole CDH deck to play. It had like a Chrome Mox and stuff, so I had most of the cards you needed that were relatively expensive already for an 8 point deck.
Mm.
Um, and then the more that I played, the more I understood what people were trying to do and what people were like, what was good and what was bad in the metagame around us. Basically, the deck that I was playing, that like Fervent Champion Metalcraft aggro tokens deck, had a really, really high ceiling because it
Mm.
had a bunch of fast mana and a bunch of like tokens and stuff, and it could do absurd things. But it had a really low floor. You would just like sometimes draw a bunch of do nothing little guys,
Hmm.
and they would get stomped, and you would be very sad. And you were much, much weaker to artifact hate than you can really manage with an aggro deck
Yeah.
because like people have to be packing a bunch of artifact hate for the combo stuff. Um,
Well, it sounds
so
like,
then after,
yeah. Go on.
yeah,
Yeah.
last bit is after a while, I was like, I want to raise the floor, lower the ceiling. If I can lower the ceiling a little bit, if I'm raising the floor way up and
Mm.
being more consistent. And I think the way to do that is with Mox Amber, if I can make that work. And I think you need about 6 or 7 legendary 1-drops to make that work. There's absolutely enough 2s and 3s.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
just, is there enough aggressive 1s to make that work? And I think there just is. And on the day of this event, a 7th one came out, Kellen Planar Trailblazer,
Yep.
and that was great. I was so
Yeah.
happy for that.
It's really nice. It's like I think that there was a deck that used to roll around the traps called We Can Be Heroes, and it was like 5 color legends. But it's really interesting to see the abuse of Mox Amber that's available to you, even in 2 colors. So, I mean, you obviously made the right decision. There you are in the top eight. This says right to left. It probably should say left to right, but that's okay. So we have a great group of people
It's just
here.
there, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. It's stage right. They're looking at it.
Yeah, exactly.
So 122 players, 7 rounds, with a lunch break, which was actually quite surprising. So
Mm.
congratulations to the judge team, of course, as well for running a really smooth event. I think that was quite a good one. I think it was a little hot, and I think that was probably the only downside that I heard people talking about. Otherwise, in the top eight, you, of course, at the top with 8 Point Boros Legends. Mouse, our committee member as well, Jeskai Arena Control, trying to prove whether or not library is worth the point. And I think
Trying to win a library with a library.
trying to win a library with a library, I think it was a very powerful choice, and he might have made it too. Except from what I remember, the last game, or from what I heard, the last game was 1-drop, 2-drop Headliner Scarlet or something like that, and then just like kill you immediately.
Game 2 was like that. Game
Yeah.
2 was turn 1 Yoshimaru. I think it was turn 1 land Yoshimaru, Mox Amber Isamaru. That makes Yoshimaru a 3/3.
Doesn't
And
get any
then
better.
it was very, very. He conceded on turn 3 in game 2.
That's
Game
good.
3 took a lot longer, but Headliner Scarlet eventually did get there.
Yeah, and I'm saying this as like people have mentioned Headliner Scarlet is just like a really powerful card. Never point worthy at all, but just like really it just pushes through initiative. It just pushes through these like board stalls, and yeah, I have very rarely seen people untap with it, because usually when it enters the battlefield you die. So very impressive.
I found that untapping with it's really good though. It's definitely underrated. If you're able to keep putting the pressure on after the fact, like if it's part of a curve out that doesn't kill them, it will be.
Yeah.
It will kill them.
Yeah, definitely. So we also saw Esper Stoneblade, Green Eldrazi, which was a ramp deck. I looked at it. Usually we used to have we've had some Melbourne players try Green Eldrazi, but that was more like stompy. But this is ramp, so it's kind of interesting to see how people take it in different directions. A bots deck with a Tinker combo. Isaac Lee, a founding member of the committee, playing Gorge and Nadu Flash. Loke, of course, on Omnath Breach Bond, which I think is going to be interesting. We'll probably look at it later as well as like an example of a different way that you can play Breach, because there was about 3 Breach decks in the room, or something around that, and it yeah, this was the one that sort of made it up to the top. So if we look at the left-hand side, the top of the leaderboard, Grixis Midrange with 13 copies, 10% of the meta. Reanimator, Mardu Midrange, starting to tick down from there. So still, it still looks nice that the meta is still split, but there's this secret hidden caveat here, and that's the reason I've highlighted or asterisked a couple of these decks, is that Mardu Midrange, Mardu Stompy, and a deck affectionately known as Laughing Raptors, using Amped Raptor and Delny and Alesha, who laughs at fate, new card from Foundations, to sort of, the deck is built around that. So it's like, it's a very creature-based deck. You're trying to like get good ETBs at very low costs. Very impressive looking deck, and we'll have a look at that later, of course. But if you mix these together, 6 Mardu Midrange, 4 Mardu Stompy, 4 Mardu Aggro, it makes like, and there was one that's not in here, the Mardu Tokens, that was using extremely similar threat package. Like most of the cards were very, very, very similar, and I think it was a lot of them were Modern Horizons 3.
I think that was my round 2 opponent. I think that was my round 2 opponent, was the Mardu Tokens player. It was very interesting.
Yeah, I looked at it and I was about to call it an aggro deck, but then I was like, you know what? This is like, feels like Mardu midrange with like 7 token cards jammed in there, you know?
Yeah.
It looked like fun, yeah. So 15 total.
It has some like rough card quality disparities, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
Right.
Blood Artist doesn't do a lot if you're not doing stuff.
That's true,
And
yeah.
if the rest of your things are trying to kill people. But if it comes together, it feels so good.
That's part of the fun, I think. That's part of the fun. So the only thing that's not listed here is 15 total Mardu decks using a very similar threat package, 13% of the meta. So now we're actually starting to talk about Grixis Midrange, and Grixis Midrange has kind of always been top dog, most represented. Usually that's a huge win share as well. So the way that we've done win share on this slide is metagame share is how many Grixis decks compared to the 113 lists that we had. So 113 out of 113 lists, 10% of them were Grixis, but out of the 47 lists that were winning decks that posted a winning record, Grixis was 17% of that share. So it kind of gives you an opportunity to see what decks were performing well. Mardu total 19% of the win share, 13% of the meta. So again, higher than this. So you can definitely see that even though these was pretty different strategies, this one's just a nice curve out deck. This one's trying to use fast mana, and this one's not trying to do either a curve out, but in a low way, you know, just go up like this. They were using a very similar threat package and made a pretty significant portion of the win rate. Is there anything else here, Henry, that you see that kind of sticks out to you in regards to win rates?
Yeah, well, the first thing in terms of like meta share I think is interesting is we can see a lot easier the delineation between Mardu midrange and Stompy and like Raptors than we can between the various variations of Grixis midrange. There is also a lot of variation within that bucket as well, but it's much more difficult to classify um, those as separate parts of the bucket or like as separate buckets within them.
Yeah.
Because like those cards that the cards that change within the Grixis midrange shell, it's got like I don't know, you could play like 90 different cards in your 60. But which ones you play with each other don't really influence that much in the same way that the Mardu decks do. So you don't see as common like packages swapped in and out, I think. So it's harder to differentiate them. Also, I wanted to. I think that the Reanimator win share is worth pointing out. It's also much higher. In fact, yeah. And then poor Stoneblade and poor Blue Moon. I don't think you're muted. I can hear you, but I have a different mic, right? You want me to keep talking while we go? Yeah. So like it's sad to see Jeskai Stoneblade down there with 0 and Blue Moon down there with 0, but like um a lot of these decks like people have ways around moons and ways to play around them. Like the reanimated decks, some of them are multiple colors, some of them are one. But they can also get threats into play before you moon them. And if you're it's kind of the issue there is with Blue Moon being like a denial deck is if your answers line up poorly to the threats that your opponents are presenting, what can you do? Even if your answers are great, it doesn't matter if they line up wrong. Um, the control decks, that'll be similarly why the control decks are having a bit more of a rougher time with the amount of threat diversity in the format versus um, the amount of specificity that you have to go kind of deep on answers. Um,
Yeah, I'll
Media technical
fix.
difficulties
I'm
screen.
right. We're live, baby. We're live. This happens when you're live sometimes. They
Yeah,
can
it's all
hear me
good.
now. It probably won't be as good a quality, but I'll fix that while we're moving on. But I think it's important to point out. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for that. The other thing that we measured last time was actually other decks. So it's kind of like
Mm,
we want to say Brewers format every time we can. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we want to say that it's Brewers format as much as we can. So I think over time we can measure if the other deck's win share goes down. But here it looks great. I mean,
yeah.
37% was decks that had less than 2 copies or less, and yeah, 36% of the win rate. So pretty nice, pretty nice.
And that looks good to me, right? Like you expect the other decks to be probably a little bit worse than the established decks just by the nature of having fewer eyes on them and having fewer reps overall for people to test things off of. Sometimes they'll be better positioned, sometimes they'll be worse, and there's an overall amount of luck there. So you probably expect other decks to have a little bit lower win share than they do metagame share. This looks basically perfect for that. Um,
Yeah,
like
I think so too. I think so too. Cool. Let's move on in the interest of time, of course. Most played cards. This comes up every time, and we saw in Vi's video. If you haven't, Volty Gamer produces videos that come out sooner. It's like shorter, 10 minutes, but it's like really helpful to just get that data out there. And this was present on her part of her discussion points as well. Was Force of Will, Fourth Aerolingus, or Coach Bowmasters. Like these cards are quite often always at the tippity top of the format. So 36% of the meta share. That's every third deck was playing Force of Will. Nearly every third deck, over every third deck was playing Fourth Aerolingus, and nearly the same for Orcish Bowmasters. So it's kind of interesting that this never changes. I think that some people have mentioned Force of Will down, Force of Will upper point. I'm not sure what that will do, but there's definitely discussions happening about what's a good, like what's okay ubiquitous and what's not okay ubiquitous, you know?
And like on the point I was saying last slide about control decks, in terms of like if your answers line up poorly with the threats that are provided to you, that your questions your opponents provide are posing, Force of Will is the best answer because it answers any threat that is provided, that is put to you. Like I think that's the exception of Urza's Saga. So it's worth the point in almost any blue deck for that reason. No matter what question your opponent asks, you can go, I'm going to say Force of Will to that, no thank you.
Yeah.
Which means that probably, in my opinion, were it to go up a point, you would probably see people pay for it still.
Yeah.
Just because
Yeah, I
it's
think so
not
too.
worth, like, it's always worth having that answer.
Yeah. It's kind of funny in this world of like mid-range as well, because mid-range is, we're going to see it has a very high meta share and it has a very high win rate, but like Force of Will is actually just not quite good enough against those decks anyway, because you have to kill a card that they have 3 more of in their hand, and you have to pay an extra card to do so.
Yep.
So I think it's funny because like if Brainstorm's always on the top of the list as well, but we're like, you know, pillar of the format. You can't play it anywhere else, you know. And it's like maybe that's okay, maybe that's not. But I know discussions are being had about that.
Yeah, and like similarly with Force of Will, Orcish Bowmasters and Caracas are both effectively answers. Orcish Bowmasters is a bit of a weird one, but like it's more an answer than not. More specifically to card draw than to, but sometimes to 1-mana creatures, and generally gives you a bunch of time against mid-range threats.
Yeah.
All these of the top 5 cards and the most played cards, 3 of them give you time to do what you're trying to do. And Fourth Aerolingus is, I think, more a function of, like, that card's really, really strong generically. It's always a good question to ask your opponent. Unless they're trying to kill you. Like, unless they're trying to kill you really fast.
Yeah.
And you can't stop that. And I don't think this metagame is very aggressive. I think it's very mid-range focused.
Totally.
And that's absolutely a metagame where Fourth is going to thrive.
Yeah, and like speaking of that sort of like that that axis of attack, is that Broadside Bombardier is still seeing a lot of play as just like a really proactive sort of mid-range. It's not mid-rangey because it's aggro, it pushes through, but like this one and White Plume, and you see White Plume at the top of the points buy. We're trying to like determine the value of a point here, so it's like 56 points per point buy.
Broadside is an aggro card, but it's an aggro card that scales with how big your deck is. Like, because it scales off of the card that you sacrifice, it can be played in a more bigger mid-range deck, and without really feeling like you're losing out on anything.
Yeah.
Because you can just chuck a Solitude at their face to deal 7.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. It's interesting. Lutri's still at the top here as well, and this is like Lutri completely justified at 3 points. I think it went from 2 to 3 really recently, and people don't care. They love it. They love it.
Yeah. People love their other friend. It's a good guy.
Absolutely. Anything else to call out here? Anything that you see?
Deathrite Shaman's really high up, even without the low green source, which means it's just being played in black decks most likely, like largely in black decks, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, it's it won't affect how we view colors, because some people just play a Bayou and move on with their life in their Grixis deck, and that sort of ubiquity is why we saw it a point before. Moving on, least played pointed cards. I mean, something here that doesn't surprise me. Gamble's still at the bottom of the list. I think it was a wise pointing because Breach liked it and Breach was getting good, but like maybe they can just have it because it's just not getting any play otherwise, but it's not seeing very much play at all. Mind Twist, I think, is still a very cromulent card, but didn't see any play. Wishclaw, Channel. Yeah, I mean, not too many surprises here. I think this had a lot of people come who were relatively new to the format. I think we had a big injection of new players and playing a bunch of Moxen and A-Call and Time Vault not really on their list of things to do.
I do think it's very funny, green being the least played color in the format, but there being a Mox Emerald in the data.
Yeah.
Is, I think, very funny.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a believer out there. There's a believer. Points by least points spent without zeros, just to give you an idea about what else is on that list. Time Twister saw
I know the Flash player. Excellent.
Two Goblin Recruiters? Okay, that's cool. I called one deck Goblin's deck and one deck I didn't call any other decks Goblin decks, so I guess that's great. Someone play Goblin Recruiter. Nothing really else here. Anything here that you'd like to point out?
Maybe Red Horde Arcanist is interesting down here, all the way down here, even with all of the Grixis and Mardu going around. People aren't on the instants and sorceries part of that. People want to be using their graveyard or their points and other stuff, even with all of the graveyard stuff that's going on in the red adjacent colors.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think people are definitely moving towards that sort of Barrow package that sort of leans you into playing more permanents like Mishra's Bauble, Urza's Bauble instead of more instants. So
yeah,
I can imagine it going down. I wouldn't anticipate it losing any points anytime soon or going to zero, despite it all. It's fine card.
Very good card.
Yeah. So moving on to most played pointed cards in the top 8. And conversion rate, so anything above 6.5 is a positive conversion rate. So if we all brought the same deck and we all had the same skill, you would have a 6.5% chance of getting into the top 8 at 113 players. So anything above 6.5 means that your odds are slightly tilted, and perhaps it was because of these pointed cards. So something that has a huge conversion rate. Of course, Library of Alexandria. There was only a couple, 3 by the looks of it, was at the event. Or it looks like maybe only 2 of them at the event, but 50% of the conversion rate. Mana Vault up there as well. Mishra's Workshop. Yeah, so there's definitely some cards here that look good, but there's definitely some that are under 6.5 as well. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, this is one of those statistics that gets kind of tricky because of the small sample size of a tournament. Because, like, the more played a card is, even if it makes it to the top 8, it will have a really low conversion rate. So, like, Broadside Bombardiers, Fourth Earlingus, are both cards that we saw as very high up there in terms of most played cards, but they're only there with 2.5 and 4.2. Caracas as well, only 3.3. Whereas the library, in this case, I'm pretty sure with how conversion rate is calculated, it has a 50-point conversion rate, which I think is probably going to be the highest, given there was only one played and it made it to the top 8.
Yeah.
So that's probably the upper bound.
No, this was I believe there was 2 Libraries of Alexandria. I think our previous thing said 3, but it might be if someone was playing on the sideboard or something. But
That'd be a sick card out of the sideboard. That's actually really cool.
Yeah. So anyone who played it in the main board, half of them made it into the top 8. So that's a good conversion rate. And then
right, two players.
Yeah. So very good. I think this is pretty interesting as we leave the sort of points portion of our discussion. I've added a new quality of life improvement for the data analysis, and this is just measuring the play rates of these cards since they've been pointed. So Mana Clash 1 was in April, and then there was the July and September points changes. So since it's funny, there was less White Plume Adventurers before it went to 2, and then it went to 2, and then more people played it. And the I think that the higher the number, the better, I suppose. It's like the play rate is how many percentage points higher in the meta it saw. So Strip Mine seems to be the sort of winner of the last points update, or sorry, last couple of points updates, because basically, I mean, 0.6 is like nothing. It means that it was 7.7% play. It was 7.7% of the meta at Mana Clash, and now it's 7.1. So basically nothing, I guess, is the answer to that one. But the rest of them, 7.1% raise uptick, and that's only because 0 played at the event at Mana Clash and 8 played at the event. So pretty big jump there. True Net Nemesis also went up, but these are two cards that went down a point. So Nadu went up in play, and then of course Lutri dropped play a little bit, but not very much. Unmounted Adventurer seems to be the loser of this situation. People just don't want to play it anymore at 1 point, so I think that's probably fine. I don't think it's better than Caves of Chaos, but like...
and there's not as enough a reason to be green.
Yes, yeah, that's an important point. And then, yeah, only other thing, the watchlist cards, so... huge drop in Bolster Citadel players. I think the watch list scared them, and then they're like, well, we just won't play it anymore. So it could fall off the watch list after this, maybe, but something that at definitely risk of staying on the watch list or even getting a point. Flage.
I think the players' long-term plans.
Yeah, exactly. Being good at Bolster Citadel, it means sometimes not taking it to an event. Phage and Psychic Frog really still shooting up in popularity as people realize how strong these cards are.
Yeah, and that similar could be said for Nadu, I think. Like that card seeing more and more play as people work out where they can fit it. Like there's the obvious spot in terms of adding it to the walks pile, but like there's probably more to it than just that. It's just that's the best place to try it first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good. Moving on, outside of the pointed cards, most played non-lands in the event. At no shock, actually dropped, I believe this is a lower meta percentage than it has been in the past. So 84% of people sleeved up Mental Misstep. We used to joke that 15% of people failed the first test of signing up to an Australian 7-point Highlander League event is not registering Mental Misstep, but I don't know. I had an opponent who was playing Mardu, and they had a Mental Misstep stuck in their hand, and they were annoyed because they wanted to be aggro, and they had a Mental Misstep. So I don't know. It's hard to say what's happening here. But any call-outs on your side?
I mean, I agree with. I think you do need to be playing Mental Misstep in this format, as long as there are like very small instances where you're not. The one obvious one. My friend Lachlan playing a deck that requires no 1-drops in it, so you can cascade into Living End.
Yeah.
Which is can't cascade into Mental Misstep.
That's an easy one.
Unless you're very lucky. But also, like, I think you have to play it just because of how many decks are trying to kill you with 1-cost spells. I would not have made my run as far as I did if I didn't get to Mental Misstep and Ephemerate when my opponent was trying to take infinite turns. I think there were like 3 points where the Mental Misstep won me a game that I otherwise had no business winning. Over the course of the tournament.
I think that's good and important, though. I actually don't feel bad at all when I'm playing a degenerate combo deck and my opponent Mental Missteps my Reanimate. I'm like, all right, dude, great. Like, you deserve it, you know. At one point, just let him have it. So I don't know. People talk about it a lot.
On the other side of these things, the reason I ended up putting Mental Misstep in my deck eventually, I didn't start with it because I wanted to test out more things, and it's a slot, and I was playing locals.
Totally.
But the reason I started putting it in my deck is because I was sick of my 1-drop getting Mental Misstepped. I'm like, stop Mental Misstepping my Zergo Bellstriker. It's right, but it's a 2/2 that's just trying to kill you. I'm trying to play some fair magic here. It's fine.
Yeah. And we see that with a lot of ubiquity cards. When we say we're doing ubiquity pointing, it's like people just play it too much, and we want people to play it less. But Mental Misstep is, I think if you put it to 1, it's essentially just banning it, because I don't know anyone who would play it at 1. Maybe you do, but it's points have such a high value these days.
After this weekend, I think I would play it. I think I would play it as a point over my Seasoned Dungeoneer.
Huge.
Because I think Seasoned Dungeoneer is my worst 4-drop, And I think not losing, being able to cast my 1-drop and resolve it on turn 1 is so important, and then not dying to Swords to Plowshares or
Yes.
Ephemerate or any kind of other 1-drop thing, like Mental Missing an opposing 1-drop blocker, all are like such important plays that I think they are more. I think Mental Misstep is more impactful in my deck than like at least Seasoned Engineer.
Interesting.
Which
That's telling.
I
That's
know
telling
it's
because Seasoned Engineer is also a very popular and popular card and powerful.
yes, but also I'm playing a deck that only cares about the first 3 rooms on the left in the initiative. Like
Yeah.
I'm not trying to do anything more than that.
Yeah.
So Seasoned Engineer is a very slow threat that just gets there in games that stalled out too long. So it is my worst point by quite a bit, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. This is we're moving on to the second portion of our talk, and it's going to be all about archetypes. I do a huge, like broad, sweeping statement that's Highlander is an individual format, and it's like your individuality is expressed through your deck. So we rely extremely heavily on people naming their decks. I think most of the time I'll take your word for it, but when we do 100 lists, 113 lists, these really big events, I go through and we do our own like assessment, and basically what we look for is have an archetype wheel which we can share later for community consultation. But if every card in your deck is good in a vacuum, you are very likely a mid-range deck, or if they're mostly good in a vacuum, they're likely a mid-range deck. And I think that we fall into this problem where mid-range is such a broad, nebulous concept that stuff tends to get dumped there, and I want to prevent that. So we see here, even though we're going through this process, mid-range 33% of the meta, aggro 31% of the meta, which don't think we've seen before. Combo and control down at that lower end.
That's a very high percentage for aggro.
Let's have a look at some of these decks. So 38 mid-range decks in the room out of the 113 reviewed, which made up 33% of the total meta, as we saw before. Huge jump at 42.6% of the win share. So nearly half the decks in the top 47 decks at the event were mid-range. And I think that sort of speaks to the power of those good mid-rangey threats that we've seen lately.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing you can be doing in a singleton format is trying to reduce your variance as much as possible.
Yeah.
And with how high card quality is these days, that the easiest way to do that is to play a mid-range pile of some kind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's where I think people tend to play, and where people will tend to, like, I think it's a kind of stable equilibrium. Like, the more mid-rangey your deck is, the more you are better positioned to play against other mid-range decks. Slowly over time, this should result in mid-range decks getting slower and slower and slower.
Yeah.
And then an aggro deck coming along and beating their kneecaps out because they're all trying to kill each other, because they're trying to kill each other too slowly.
Yeah.
Big fan of the old metric of you want to be slightly slower or a lot faster than your opponent. So the big thing that mid-range lets you do is it lets you shift how fast you are.
Yeah.
With mid-range getting this total meta share and this total win share as well, 40. I think this is a very high win share for the archetype. Well, I guess not archetype. Archetype?
The macro archetype.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a huge win share, and yeah, I agree. It's interesting that people choose to reduce variance in different ways, like, and we saw with the recent depointing of Demonic Tutor and that huge jump, the uptick in doing that, like playing Demonic Tutor, playing Demonic Council, as well as the new Demonic Tutor that has been seeing players, like, that's how combo reduces variance, but they have to pay 2 mana to do that. Like, these mid-range decks, they don't have to pay any premium to put a good card in their hand, because all their cards are good cards, Yeah.
Yeah. And it's harder for, like, the faster archetypes to do that. And it's harder for the slower archetypes to do that, because there's just not nearly as much redundancy in very low to the ground aggro cards, and there's not nearly as much redundancy in answers.
Yeah.
So that leads to mid-range getting the most out of the new sets more often than not, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we did see like, as I mentioned before, Demonic Council, but even in the same set was Abhorrent Hoculus, which was actually just like pretty good mid-range threat. You know, made 7 power on the turn that it gives to the opponent. So it's like
That card's so absurd.
it
It's
is really
so
good.
much harder. It's like Barrowgrowth is the card I hate seeing the most as an
Yeah.
aggro player personally. And Oculus is very similar in that regard because it just keeps making more and more blockers.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that
and then
board
eventually you
control
have
and
enough
of a
blockers and they
mid-range
just
deck.
kill you in the air.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, those decks. All right. Very good. Very good.
All right, combo.
Yeah. So, what do you see? What do you see, Henry? Take us through combo.
That's 6 Reanimator. 2 in the top 8 is particularly interesting, I think. Making way all the way through the field. Especially with how combo, I think, is generally significantly more difficult to pilot than many of the other archetypes. So you have to really be, you have to really be invested to want to play your combo deck.
Totally.
Um,
And it's funny,
I
there's
think-
kind of 2 rogue combo decks as well that end up making the top 8. Like, Omnath Bond Breach is like fast bond and breach. So you just like, you can also win by fast bond strip mine your opponent to death, which is like an interesting sort of avenue to lean on. But yeah, Gorgia Nadu Flash from Isaac. He's been a Hulk player in the past. It was pretty interesting to see. He's just jamming them all into one. The Nadu combo, the Flash combo, and the Gorgia combo. And I mean, it went well. Went well for him.
yeah.
Big
I
win
think
share as
also-
well.
I think also the interesting thing is how many of these combo decks use the graveyard. Especially with how much most of the mid-range decks also use the graveyard. That is like such an important resource in this format. And if you're a mid-range deck using the graveyard, it becomes harder for you to hate on your opposing combo player's graveyard. You have to be more specific in your hate. And similarly, the combo decks can't use, or have to be careful about using graveyard hate to try and slow the mid-range decks down. They're going to have to try and find a different way around to create their own roadblocks.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting, and it's. I think the Nadu combo. It's interesting that we haven't seen. I mean, we're going to call Nadu Walks a mid-range deck because it's the only combo that can be a mid-range deck because Time Walk is also just an explore, so it's like none of the pieces actually affected too much. But yeah, Nadu being one of the very few decks that would have been in this list, not using the graveyard, with the exception of being Thoracle, which actually doesn't use the graveyard at all, but I don't think it had a really positive win share overall.
Yeah, and like the artifact combos don't necessarily need it either. I know a lot of them are on Portal to Phyrexia, which does sort of need the graveyard to start killing your opponent, but you have other win conditions, you don't need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Control decks here, probably one of the bigger losers, even though we did see one in the top 8. 15% of the total meta share, only 8% of the win share. Tough. I mean, there's actually 2 here. There's one in Eldrazi ramp, and that's just big Eldrazi. And the other one being, of course, Mouse playing Jeskai Control. But still, overall, people are playing it, and it doesn't feel like it's strong enough, maybe.
I mean, here's those 3 Blue Moon decks from earlier.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Moving on. Now we're into sort of the aggro quadrant. We have 3 different types of aggro decks here. Stompy is... I use like a really golden rule of 3 or more. So if I see 3 or more pieces of ramp, I'm presuming that you can have times in your life where you draw the ramp piece when you didn't want to and whatever, and that sort of makes you less of a mid-range deck. So Stompy just trying to line up those 3 and 4 drop, really powerful 3 and 4 drops, powering them out early, Soul Ring, Chromox Lotus Petal. Rashad, current world Highlander champion, narrowly missing his winning in, of course, to get into the top 8 himself, but 17th. for Rashad on 8-point Mardu and It Stompy. Not too dissimilar from your deck, but I think it's different in the parts that it's important to be different.
Absolutely. It's the biggest thing I would say that makes it different is the number of one-cost cards that are permanents. Like, I'm on 11 one-cost creatures, and most people are on 1 to 3, and then they're trying to get their curve started on 2 and 3, and then, like, be able to play and actually cast Fury some amount of the time, for example. Fourth Angus is a lot better when you have Soul Ring in your deck. 1-drops are a lot worse. You really don't want, like, if you have the choice between a 1-drop and a Soul Ring, your 1-drop becomes a lot worse because you have to develop the Soul Ring early, and then developing the 1-drop at any point later feels bad.
Yeah.
I think that makes it quite different. It also means, like, you can play a lot more expensive answers, and, like, Flage is a really powerful card that I don't get to play. Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. I think Stompy decks here, 12% of the win share, 11% of the total meta, so just under. But yeah, it looks here like aggro. It's got a low win share overall, and perhaps it's just the nature of mid-range decks playing more to the board, and mid-range decks giving those like protecting the board and getting the initiative and making it harder for aggro decks to push through. But yeah, aggro decks probably negative win share as well.
Saying on what I was saying earlier, right? I'm in the who's the beatdown kind of mantra that old thing is.
Of course.
You want to be a lot faster or a bit slower. I really think Stompy and Tempo are very poorly positioned flavors of aggro in a mid-range metagame, because you are slower than pure aggro, and only very slightly faster than most mid-range decks.
Yeah.
Which is really not where you want to be. That means they're going to be more often than not preying on you. I also think that, like, if you're playing the 3-color versions, you are much more likely to stumble, and you really can't afford to stumble as an aggro deck.
Yeah.
You need to be as consistent as possible. I have a personal bias in terms of how to avoid that, in that I like playing a lot more mana sources than most people do in their aggro decks.
Interesting. Yeah.
You take a look at, if we might get to my list later, but I've got 19 lands plus 2 MDFCs plus Chrome Mox plus Mox Amber, plus Lotus Petal. So I've got 24, I think, total mana sources, and I was on 25 until the day before this.
That's interesting.
Like, I want to be casting my 1, my 2, my 3 as frequently as possible, and then I want my lands. But the upside to being a 2-color deck is, I get a ton of utility lands that are great top decks. They're perfectly fine to top deck, and they're perfectly fine to get out early and have extra value out of. Like,
yeah, absolutely. The Ganjo and the Soken-Zan, yeah. You're adding more lands than normal, but you're trying to make more of your land spells, and I think that's it worked. It worked here, and it worked for you, and it's interesting. People are not very high on MDFCs anymore. I feel like the ones that are sorceries and stuff, but the Sundering Eruption I've seen a couple of times, and I think it's important to have them on tap. I think that's like a really important part of the aggro sort of mantra, but the fact that most of your cards here do something else as well, even as simple as the Sunbaked Canyon drawing you a card, like, it allows you to not get mana screwed more often, and, you know, sometimes do a thing, make 2 spirits or draw a card.
Yeah. Like, even the basic lands are only here because of utility of being able to play around opposing Maguses or Blood Moons out of various decks that are cading. I want to be able to get my own land off initiative, and I want to be able to get a land off person path exiling me.
Yeah.
The card I cut for Kellen was Basic Mountain.
Yeah.
I don't want Basic Mountain. It is the worst mono red land in my deck. Like,
I think some people would agree with you on that for sure, because it definitely seems to be the least played. Even in these Magus of the Moon decks, of course, you just don't really care whether or not it's whether or not it's a mountain, whether or not it's a basic land, because it's going to be a mountain regardless.
Yeah, I just like Stompy's cool. You get to do really cool things and feel really good when you cast things.
Mm,
But like, it's so much less consistent than
yeah.
just trying to kill him.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we'll have a look at Laughing Raptors later, but as we mentioned at the start, Mardu Aggro, also a very interesting deck. But yeah, again, 43%, so nearly half of aggro lists in the room were pure aggro, not Stompy, not tempo. But still, only 14% of the meta, 10% of the win share. So it's interesting. It's good to see you come through, fight through the nonsense. But it seems like it was tough for your compatriots in the same
Yeah.
area.
Barragoyf's a really tough card,
Yeah.
and there's a ton of Barragoyfs. Like, the biggest two archetypes are Grixis midrange and Mardu midrange, and they're both on Barragoyf.
Yeah.
Like, it's rough. But
It seems it.
yeah. The problem, I think, with multiple colors is, like, Sunder Eruption's actually a really good card, right? It falters.
Mm.
If you have Headliner Scarlet and Sundering Eruption, you have 2 falter effects in your deck. You got
Yeah.
some ways around lifelink cards. You can just... I also think the equipment package is very important. Lava Spur Boots
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Mabel both make haste equipments, which makes your opponent have to play really slow, which means you have a bunch more time to top deck a relevant card.
Yeah, it's
really
interesting
fun.
that Lava Spur Boots didn't see more play.
That
I know
card's so
people were
good.
high on it, especially because you can get it with Urza's Saga, but it's like it's hard to battle. It's hard to battle the spear, Shadow Spear, but I don't know. You did well
I
with yeah. It
I don't
looked
think I've
good.
gotten Shadow Spear in like 2 months.
Oh
Like,
wow. Okay, there you go. It's good. It's good for
admittedly,
the lifelink. Yeah.
there's not a lot of aggro at my regular
Okay.
tournament though.
Yeah, I see it. Moving on, just touching on it slightly. This is an example of card decks that kind of look mid-rangey as well, like Grixis Bus Stop. And again, there's like maybe there'd be 2 or 3 cards different between a Grixis Bus Stop list and a Grixis Tempo list. But as MTG Top 8, sort of the wider archetype distribution sort of website, they've said that this is Stoneblade as a tempo deck. This is looking very Stonebladey to me. If you're doing pre-war formalware stuff, it's like I think you're just trying to push a little bit more. Like True Name's a really fun, True Name's a really fun card, but it's not really mid-range. I guess it's kind of mid-range, but yeah, the middle point. It's a very nebulous concept as well, tempo, and it's often discussed, but they did not perform well at this event.
Yeah. Formalware's a really weird card too, in terms of using it to place whether a deck is like tempo or aggro, because it depends so much on what threats you're trying to return.
Yeah.
Like, if you're returning True Name Nemesis, I'm feeling that's probably in the closer to tempo or stompy or mid-range base, probably more mid-range.
Yeah.
But like, if you're an Amadu deck that's trying to return it, or a Boros deck, and you're trying to return Broadside Bombardiers, that's an aggro play if I ever saw one,
yeah,
because
yeah.
you're attacking for 4 and then throwing
Big
another
time.
5 at their face.
Big time. Well, I think
So-
at the very least, all these decks form part of the aggro quadrant.
Yeah.
I can see you trying to get a little bit of mid-range value, but as we said before, if a mid-range deck is every deck is valuable in its own right, pre-war formalware just requires just a little bit of synergy, like just a little bit. So
Yeah.
I think it's really similar. This is for you, my friend. Our wonderful 8-point lists for the day. There you are at the very top in dazzling lights. League of Legends, as you affectionately called it, when I asked you in the top 8 what you wanted to call your deck.
And I responded with, people find it particularly tilting when I call it League of Legends.
Yes, exactly. So here it is in dazzling lights. 24% of the total meta, 12% of the win share. So we've actually seen last event really like quite neutral mid win share, but this is unfortunate, a little bit less. But you will have that new player bias, I think, come into this a lot. Is that there's a slight correlation between people dipping their toes into the format for the first time and choosing an 8-point list. So it's a difficult format. So it requires some time and I think that's a negative correlation. But it's nice to measure it, and I think it's important to know how competitive is it to play an 8-point list.
Yeah, and I also think that, like, at a big tournament like this, a lot of the 8-point stuff ends up in a poor position to, if a 7-point mid-range deck is so consistently strong, an 8-point mid-range deck is ever so slightly slower, or ever so slightly doing more damage to itself, and ever so slightly less consistent, and you're just gonna have a bit more of a rough time. That said, there's also a couple archetypes here that were also in the like not having a pretty low win share thing because there's overlap between those. So
Yeah, I think so too.
which I think is interesting and worth pointing out. Like,
Yeah.
The Stoneblade decks are between 53rd, 55th, 56th. And then lower down, like, the Miracles deck at the bottom, there's another Stoneblade there. Like, that first one, it's one of those ones which,
Oops, there we go.
looked like it landed pretty middle of the pack.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, we had, so, and 47% is not half, you know, and that's kind of like the funny, and I think there will be, like, a little bit of funny data because there was 124, but only 113 carried. But yeah, it's a fine spread. I mean, there's only probably everyone under this Mardu mid-range deck, but still 2 Mardu mid-range in that sort of winning bracket. But yeah, these unfortunate players will have to try again next time to get their 8-point glory.
Now this I think is really interesting.
Tell me about it.
Just like playing 8 points and 57% playing 3 colors is really interesting to me because you're absolutely taking a massive hit to the mana base playing 8 points, and still feeling like you can comfortably play 3 colors is a choice, and it's not necessarily a bad choice. Like you can probably consistently casting your spells. It just is going to open you up. It's going to make you significantly weaker to the opposing fast starts where like a threat gets down, and if you fetch shocked twice, that's so much life. If you're a black variant deck as well and you're playing Thoughtseize and you're going to hurt yourself a bit more too, like
the way that I see this actually is like less it's not so much lots of people are playing 3-color decks, I think, and we'll see this on the next slide over. It's just that less people are playing 4-color decks or 5-color decks, you know, because the 5-color decks and the 4-color decks, as we see in the next one over, which is just comparing 7-point, you see that there's this big jump here of 4 colors. And this is not, I'm splashing green for Deathrite Shaman. This is like, I am playing 4 colors in my deck. And maybe it's like, there's less Omnath mid-range that is 8 points or whatever, and there's like the less sort of well-known 4-color decks can't be played in 8 points, but yeah, you can see here that huge jump is really closely aligned, because even here, 60% 3 colors for 7-point, 57%, so it's still like more people are playing 3 colors overall, I guess, in 7-point, but that's just huge pie here that's not really represented in 8-point.
Just reading the chat real quick, I think you make a really good point. I haven't really been considering the Duskmourn, the Verges and what they've added, especially given that they are like effectively extra fast lands that work well into mid range if you have the basics or like the basic land types. Like I think in past you might have seen a bigger 2-color and then a bigger 2-color in the amongst 8 points and a smaller 3-color. Now you're seeing a bigger 3-color and still a very small 4. I think this is a very similar. You might be seeing a similar shift up colors, right? Where it's easy. Like you just said, it's easier to play 4 colors at 7 points than it is to play 3. Where it used to be easier to play 3 colors than it was 2. I haven't really considered the Duskmourn Verges because the red-white one is the wrong way around for what I wanted. So I haven't really seen its effect on the metagame that much. But I think that's a really good point.
The Surveil lands as well, of course, gave a really big boost to all decks, because like 7-point decks definitely want to play Surveil lands as well. So then suddenly you actually have a new cycle of fetchable dual lands that are quite good.
I do also think that I have some bias here in terms of like we saw how many utility lands are in my deck before. I love a good utility land, and if you're playing 3 colors, you can't play quite nearly as many utility lands.
Yes.
You got to cast spells.
That's right. Less cards doing fun stuff, more of them supplying your mana base with cards.
You got to try channeling a Gandra for 1 mana. It feels great.
I'm looking forward to it. Even at 3 mana, I like that card. You know, I don't mind paying 3 for it.
Channeling Sekenzen for 1 on an aggro turn in with a
Ooh.
Flowering of White Tree in play. Oh,
Okay, you're
oh.
speaking my language. Moving on only slightly. This is more the colors themselves. I think something that has been sort of recurring over this time is green is getting the short end of the stick lately.
Yeah, which is interesting given that like green used to be sort of like a mid-range king, I think, right? Like people used to love playing a dork into a 3-drop. Well, I guess it's more close to Stompy, but it depends a bit on like the mid-range threats used to be so core in Magic, I think. And green just doesn't. It's just not keeping up. I think like haste out of red's so important. The black threats are usually the various goyfs are bigger than the green threats. So how are you attacking past them? The blue and black delve cards are bigger than green before they get a chance.
Yeah.
Like what's the draw to green then?
Yeah.
It's really tricky.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
I think the answer is mana dorks, but mana dorks are very fragile.
Oh yeah.
And it's very hard to get the ratios right so that you feel happy playing mana dorks, but you can still cast your spells if they're answered.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think green could definitely get a boost. It's like green used, as you said, it used to be the king of midrange. You know, you play a Oko, you play a Neuro, and you really take away the game with something like Sultai. But yeah, just also yeah, and we did mention this in the previous analysis video, but Modern Horizons 3 just didn't have very many green cards in it, so that was just like a funny part of it, I think, as well.
Yeah, like most of the cards in the Simic commander deck that were good were all the lands, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then in the Jund one, it's the red and the black ghosts people were happy with.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just to cap us off, and we're going to leave some room for any questions, or even if you want to ask the data some questions and we can find it if it hasn't been answered here. We try to get every data point that we think is important, but people keep adding to that, and that's good. That's what we want. So let us know if there's anything that you think is important soon. But while we talk about that, just last thing, I guess, is the top 8 finishes from the last 7 events. We added our new ones in there, and still Grixis at the tippity top. I think Turbo Initiative seems to be taking a turn, although pre-pointing did have a really large showing. Omnath Prowess, some mid-range decks after that, Reanimator, and then still like a nice spattering of random, you know, there's just as much random 1s as there are 2s, 3s, and 11s, you know?
Yeah, and I want to think, from what I've seen of the initiative stuff, I know I'm relatively new to the format, having started only in February. I don't think that the current versions of Turbo Initiative are they're like on roughly the same level as the various other mid-range piles you can do. Like, especially because those mid-range piles are very capable of getting the initiative off you, and very capable of answering an initiative creature. If you're trying to Turbo Initiative and that's your whole game plan, if that gets answered or you get the initiative taken from you, it's not great.
Yeah.
I think the metagame has properly adapted to the initiative, from what it looks like to me.
Yeah, seems so. Boxing Day Melbourne missing from the event list. Oh, I thought. Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. Add that. Send me the details for that. Completely forgot. You can see by the fact that it says Pog Winnerduel Vic, Eternal Masters Vic, that we are very Vic-centered. Poor Perthians. We need to see a couple of big Perth events on the other side of the world as well. But yes, thank you for that. I'll include it in the next one. But what's next for Highlander? Tomorrow is the next points announcement. So the committee will tell us what they think should go down in points, what they think should go up, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. If you're in the ACT at the end of the month, we have a winner duel. Boxing Day is just after Christmas on Boxing Day, would you believe, in Melbourne. And then Isaac's birthday bash in Victoria. Two team trios events on this list. Have you ever played a team trio event, Henry?
I played a team sealed event once,
Okay.
and that was GP Sydney Hour of Devastation. That was a lot of fun.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
But I've never played a Teams Trio event. I was joking around with some friends about how, since this is apparently not unified 7-point Highlander, or like not unified points either, you could all play the exact same list in theory.
Yes.
And if we all brought Boros Legends, that truly would be a League of Legends.
It would. It would. Yes, I'm super down for that. The one, so Mana Clash down there at the bottom, non-unified team trios, and the Isaac's Birthday one team trio. So we will be able to compare which ones you could do. But I like the unified. It gives it a little flavor. Unified. It's definitely like additional deck building restrictions. We're already huge fans of that because we like singleton plus fitting in points into your deck. So additional restrictions is a lot of fun. But yeah, I'm gonna try and cobble together 2 other Reanimator players and see if we can bring 3 Reanimate decks to Mana Clash on the 26th and 27th of April next year, and then we'll be in the new year. How wonderful! Some couple of things before we sort of wind down. We have a couple of decks that we can look at and talk about together while people sort of leave the building. But the only other things that I wanted to mention is that we did a new player survey. Any details about Isaac's Birthday Bash? Yes, 100%. This is the only details I have. 100% on this date, 4th and the 5th of Jan. I think we're still waiting for because we just had the Mana Clash event being spoiled. So I think they're trying to be strategic about the announcement. But yes, definitely on these dates, and we'll work it out, the prizes and stuff. So the new player survey, it was only small. It was it doesn't say how many people played it, but I did if you entered the format in the last 2 years, what brought you in? And of course, I hacked it by putting in a option that says the community was kind and welcoming, which great. That's really wonderful news. But I think most of the people came in because their friends had it. Their friends enjoyed it, and they came in as well. So it's really heartening.
What I did.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Which Lurrus Breach list top 8? It's not a Lurrus Breach deck. It would be a Omnath Bond Breach, which was Lockie's Brew. So you can find that. Actually, I think I have the command. If you type in Dex, oops, not that way. If you type in Dex, there we go. Never mind. All right. Well, if you type in deck, we'll get there. There we go. You can access the lists here, of course. I'll put everything in the show notes for when we upload this to YouTube. But also, of course, the 7-point archetype wheel is open for community consultation. We made this like 2 years ago. And it kind of just helps people understand their deck a little bit better. It's nice to have... this has its own limitations. It's technically a 1D graph. There's no political compass here. It's you can't do it on multiple axes, but it kind of just gives you the push, the tug of war that decks always have, where they can't play too much synergy cards because you'll lose your value cards. You can't play too many reactive cards because it'll take away from your proactive cards. So those are kind of the way that this is done. It's based off Patrick Chapin's wheel from a long time ago. So go to the Discord. If you are not already there, you probably are already because that's where most of our friends are, but you can find us there. And, find the thread in Highlander General, and it's open for community consultation. Probably next year we'll review those results and then make a change, and then I'll do a big presentation on that, so that sounds like fun. But otherwise, we're going to look at some fun decks that we liked. If you have any feedback, if you have anything that you like, if you have anything that you want to show, if you have anything that you want to ask, please feel free to do so now. But, we're going to go through some decks that we liked and talk about them. I think you dodged this deck, right, in the top 8?
I did dodge this deck. I played against the Omnath Fastbond Breach deck in the quarters, and I played against the Mono Green Eldrazi deck in the semis, and then the Jeskai Library Arena Control in the finals.
Yeah, very nice.
Thankfully dodged this.
Yeah, Natural Order, Flash. We've got the whole friendship group is here. And something I think is really funny about this is that you're actually protein hulking into Nadu combo.
Nice.
Um,
That's so cool.
so it kind of saves you having to play the kind of dorky other stuff. But yeah, really impressive, fun-looking deck for sure. This is the deck that you versed. How did it play? How did you feel when you versed it?
Um, it was interesting. Game one was an absolute slog.
Hmm.
Um, uh, where I managed to get Mouse down to like 7, and I had a 7/8 Pyroglyph in hand, and I was like, my Mox Amber was on some of the time and off some of the time. Um, and they managed to discard Flage off of Fable and escape it, and gain just enough life to stay out of the Pyroglyph range.
Outrageous.
Just like a lot of play. I got Mystic Confluence, bouncing all 3 of my attacking creatures once. That was pretty sick.
That's heartwarming. That's heartwarming.
In the final game, had the very fun experience of Mouse brainstorming into Urza's Bauble plus Mishra's Bauble, keeping them, playing both. Playing Urza's Bauble to see the Broadside Bombardier in my, to see the Headliner Scarlet in my hand, and then Mishra's Bauble to see the Broadside Bombardier on top of my deck. While very much I'm quite ahead on board, so they were not happy about that.
Yeah, yeah.
I do think there's some iffy choices here. I think they're very cool, but I think Electrolyze is a little bit past its day in the sun.
It's funny that it's there, you know. But Flame of Lenore seemed to be the new Electrolyze, but maybe if you can play both. You can play both.
Can play both. You can play both.
Coming out of the chat, discussing with a friend, they expressed disappointment when they faced a recent tournament. Large amount of Mardu colored, yeah. I think Mardu, it could see a point. I mean, Flagel's on the watch list. It did have a really positive win rate. So
I
who
would
knows?
personally love for Flage to get a point because it's one of the best cards against me, and I'm a Boros deck that can't play it. Like it just is far
Infuriating.
too slow
Yeah.
for my deck.
Yeah.
Like I can't even Arena of Glory. I have no basic mountain. I have just my 2 shock and my Surveil land, so I can't get that untapped often enough.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see. This is from our player, from our local team, playing Key and Wheel. I really love this deck because it doesn't win in any other way than like infinite memory jar. To put a bunch of cards back on top of your library, memory jar again, put a bunch of cards on top of your library, memory jar again. It's truly magnificent to see it go off. Pretty positive win rate as well at 15th. Slightly different.
Interesting,
yeah.
not all in on the different various Crucible of Worlds. There's one more they could be playing from.
Oh,
there's
that's
a
right. The
green
walk-in
room
closet.
that they're not
Yeah.
playing.
Walk-in closet and something. But yeah, that's probably just because it's not an artifact, I would say.
Yeah.
This is an example of one of these Laughing Raptors decks. So Amped Raptor and Alesha who laughs at fate, and also do we see Delny in here as well? This list seems to not be playing Delny, but I've seen it in these sorts of lists before as just ways to benefit from these various ETB triggers that you have. Failure there as well. So lots of just cards that have nice ETBs, extremely cheap. And I think although 32nd is only 4/3, I think this was a pretty powerful looking deck. Speaking of being annoyed at all the Mardu decks in the room.
Absolutely. I do personally not. I'm not sold on the Black Splash in the various aggro decks. Only one Raptor, sadly, but the energy package is. But the energy stuff's really powerful. So
Yeah. If
what
you
can
flicker
do?
it,
But
if you flicker it, it technically counts as a new instance of Raptor. So
yeah,
that's probably what
I
they're
just
thinking.
I don't think that in an aggro deck, I don't think Inquisition and Thoughtseize really cover your weaknesses much.
Yeah.
And I think that's the main draw into black. I think like Alesha's really powerful, and that I could see being a good draw. Baraglyph's very powerful, especially if you're drawing graveyard stuff. Like Fear of Missing Out's really interesting and really good. But like we're on Fatal Push, Galvanic Discharge, Lightning Bolt, Swords. We're not on Path. As another piece of unconditional removal in a
Yeah.
format where Reanimate is really strong, and I think unconditional removal is really powerful.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This deck just makes me happy. 76th, Mike S. With Technicolor Dreamcat. It's I actually think that Lurrus is like a pretty popular way to, is a probably not popular way to play aggro, but these are all really aggro threats. Probably Bowmaster's a little bit not necessarily aggro, but you know the Kavu and the Tarmogoyf and the Psychic Frog, like these are all just like good creatures, and you're using
Yeah.
Lurrus as like a safe way to put it all together, and I quite like it.
It's really, really good. The one critique I would have, and this is a soapbox I've been on for a while, is if you're playing Giver and Mother in an aggro deck, you should also play Skrelv. Skrelv is really
Interesting.
good.
Yeah.
Play Skrelv.
Okay.
Like, you don't care about blocking. You're an aggro deck. It doesn't matter Skrelv can't block. When is your Giver or Mother blocking anyway?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've played Skrelv a couple of times in a few lists, and it was like I actually just wanted one less Mother of Runes, but maybe that's wrong, you know, because
I think that's possibly fair. Drawing all three is very bad.
yeah,
You have to have the, I guess, discipline to mulligan all three. I have kept them a number of times and lost every game I have kept all three. But you really want one a lot, I think.
Yeah.
Especially when you have powerful threats like Territorial Kavu, that you want to protect. Psychic Frog. Like, I think Skrell is really good. Mockingbird's so good. Just so you know, like Mockingbird's. Like,
I've heard good
I haven't
things
got
about
to play with
Mockingbird
it.
as well. Yeah.
Mockingbird's so good.
Mm.
You ever play a Ragavan, then your opponent plays their own flying Ragavan?
Whew.
It's terrifying.
Whew. Yeah, it's cool. It scales. It's yeah. It seemed really impressive. I've heard some people talking about it. I haven't seen it in action, but I'm impressed. This is one you wanted to call out as well, Henry. Why don't you take us through it?
Yes. Okay, so this is the only deck in the format where it's right to not play Mental Misstep. This is my friend Lachlan's deck. We went to high school. We were together. They're a brewer at heart. They are the brewer that this format is trying to attract, and it's a true masterpiece what they've got here. This deck is Living End. This is a Living End deck that is 80 cards singleton, that is trying to put Delirium into the graveyard with various cyclers and evoke cards, and fetch lands and such, and then use one of the various creature tutors you have and various ways to find a creature to tutor for the 2-drop Bloodbraid Marauder, which is a 3/1 which can't block and has Cascade if you have Delirium, and then you cascade through your entire deck into
Wow.
Living End,
Impressive.
and Living End all those cyclers and evoke elementals and various
my
stuff
goodness.
into play, and it's good. It's so good.
Yeah, there was a Cephalobreakfast deck as well. This is the thing that really excites me about this actually is that I didn't even look hard enough and realize that you are playing those 2-drops. You're just getting the tutor, and then you can play Balance, and then you can play Demonic Council, Demonic Tutor, Pillage the Bog is good as well. Like I
this deck's
kinda
really
love it.
consistent.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
deck's really, really consistent.
Interesting. Interesting.
And it's not that slow. Like that, you are giving up the ability to play any 1-cost card or any 0-cost card, which means you can't use any of the unfair mana, and you can't
Except the
use any
Surveil
of the
lands.
except the Surveil lands. Exactly, right? Like, you're an 80 card. It's an 80 card list largely, I think, so Lockie can play more. So that Lockie can decrease their chance of naturally drawing Living End.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you've only got one copy of it.
I like it.
And it's
I like it
such
a
a
lot.
sweet deck.
I like
It's
it a
so
lot.
cool. And this is
Um,
31st too. This is a positive win rate.
Yeah, that's 4-2 if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I have to give this a
think
go.
so.
I tried Hypergenesis before, and that was really fun. But I didn't even. I was trying to do 3 and less, and this is 2 and less.
Yeah.
And that's really impressive. It really unlocks a lot of fun cards for you, like Up the Beanstalk, Animate Dead, Survival of Fittest. Really liking that a lot.
It has really good secondary game plans by only having to play by being able to play its 2-drops.
He should take note from the modern Living End players and press the attack for when he gets stuck in hand. Okay, there you go. There's some tech.
I think that is a particularly rough one when you're in a singleton format. I think like it's really tricky to play you want to play your 1 out card for the one time you draw your
yeah, the mass doesn't quite mass.
Garnet.
Yeah,
like it's bad.
Yeah. That's why you just put Cavalier of Gales into your deck, and then you can brainstorm it back onto top of your library. Wonderful.
I know Lockie originally was playing the I forget what it's called. It's like 1 in a red, like Fiery Prophecy or something.
Yeah.
There's one that you draw
3 damage, put a card back on the bottom of your library, draw a card.
Yeah, put a card on the bottom, draw a card. Yeah.
Very good. Very impressive.
It's not quite good enough.
A nice one, yeah. I liked seeing that the rogue decks had a positive win rate. I like seeing more decks like this in the field, and less homogeneity. So it'll be interesting to see what changes come out of the next points update. We'll see that tomorrow. Henry, it was an absolute pleasure looking through this analysis with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I've had a great time.
Yeah.
I have one last thing I want to say.
Of course.
To all the Mardu and Grixis mid-range players out there. There is a lot of room to brew in this format.
Yeah.
Yes, we know what the best stuff is, but the best stuff only is the best stuff until you find new, better stuff to kill people with.
Yes. Yeah.
The
meta adjusts as well.
Yeah. Don't get too married to your piles. There's stuff out there that will win.
Yeah.
Take Mox Amber and Isamaru, for example.
That's right. Take the Boros Legends player's word for it. This is the place to go. Yeah, some truly inspiring words. If you catch this later, you'll be catching it at youtube.com/CBRMTG. If you're watching right now, you're watching on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/CBRMTG. Join us on Discord. This is where all the fun happens. This is where we talk. I don't use Facebook anymore except to promote the Discord. So it's a great place to reach us. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Doctor. Thank you so much. Check out the website whenever you can. Articles posted basically after every event. You won't see us until maybe after the winter duel. If it goes well, if we get a lot of players, we'll do a meta-analysis for that at the end of the month. And then we're off. Have a really wonderful, happy holiday. And then we'll be back for Team Trios again. So keep an eye out for all of that. I'll put the deck lists here if you want to look at them in the future. Whoopsie, he's not there. I'll put them here. And then, yeah, wonderful. Thanks again, Henry, for joining us. And we'll see everyone next time.
Yeah. Have a good one, all.
See ya.